Heavy dump trucks unload dark brown copper ore rocks at the world's biggest copper factory raw material yard. Massive piles of raw copper ore stacked at the world's biggest copper factory before crushing. Huge industrial crushers at the world's biggest copper factory, breaking large rocks into smaller pieces. Secondary crushers further reduce copper ore size inside the world's biggest copper factory.
Large rotating grinding mills at the world's biggest copper factory, turning crushed copper ore into fine powder. Water added to ground copper ore, forming slurry inside the world's biggest copper factory. Large flotation tanks separate copper minerals from waste at the world's biggest copper factory. Industrial dryers remove moisture from copper concentrate at the world's biggest copper factory. Dried concentrate enters the smelting furnace at the world's biggest copper factory.
Molten copper matte forms inside furnace at the world's biggest copper factory.
Impurities removed as slag from molten copper at the world's biggest copper factory.
Molten copper transferred to converter furnace at the world's biggest copper factory.
Oxygen injected into molten copper at the world's biggest copper factory, removing remaining impurities.
99% pure blister copper forms at the world's biggest copper factory.
Molten copper poured into large rectangular molds at the world's biggest copper factory.
Fresh copper anodes cooling at the world's biggest copper factory.
Copper anodes placed in large electrolytic tanks at the world's biggest copper factory. Powerful electric current flows through large refining tanks inside the world's biggest copper factory, where thin layers of 99.99% pure reddish-orange copper slowly build up on stainless steel cathode plates. Impurities settle at the bottom of the tank as anode slime, while pure reddish-orange copper forms in the world's biggest copper factory. Finished 99.99% pure reddish-orange copper cathode sheets are lifted from tanks inside the world's biggest copper factory. Copper cathode sheets are washed with clean water at the world's biggest copper factory to remove electrolyte residue. Automated scanners inspect 99.99% pure reddish-orange copper sheets inside the world's biggest copper factory. Robotic arms stack uniform reddish-orange copper cathode plates at the world's biggest copper factory. Pure reddish-orange copper cathodes are melted again in large furnaces at the world's biggest copper factory. Molten reddish-orange copper flows into a continuous casting machine inside the world's biggest copper factory. Long, solid reddish-orange copper rods emerge from casting line at the world's biggest copper factory. Hot reddish-orange copper rods move along cooling conveyors inside the world's biggest copper factory. Machines polish and clean reddish-orange copper rods at the world's biggest copper factory. Copper rods enter wire drawing machines at the world's biggest copper factory. Copper rods are pulled through precision dies, becoming thinner wires at the world's biggest copper factory. Ultra-thin reddish-orange copper wires move rapidly through the drawing line at the world's biggest copper factory.
Copper wires pass through a annealing furnace at the world's biggest copper factory to improve flexibility.
Annealed reddish-orange copper wire cools rapidly in water baths at the world's biggest copper factory. Machines wind continuous reddish-orange copper wire into large coils at the world's biggest copper factory. Thick reddish-orange copper conductors are produced at the world's biggest copper factory for industrial use.
Flat reddish-orange copper bars are cut and shaped at the world's biggest copper factory.
Molten reddish-orange copper is extruded into hollow tubes at the world's biggest copper factory.
Automated saws cut reddish-orange copper products to exact sizes at the world's biggest copper factory.
Copper sheets and rods are polished to mirror finish at the world's biggest copper factory.
Sensors measure thickness of reddish-orange copper sheets at the world's biggest copper factory.
Copper wires are tested for conductivity at the world's biggest copper factory. Finished reddish-orange copper rods and sheets are bundled at the world's biggest copper factory. Copper products are wrapped in protective covering at the world's biggest copper factory.
Each reddish-orange copper bundle receives tracking labels at the world's biggest copper factory. Forklifts load reddish-orange copper bundles onto trucks at the world's biggest copper factory. Large containers filled with reddish-orange copper products leave the world's biggest copper factory.
Copper cargo transported by freight train from the world's biggest copper factory. Reddish-orange copper wires from the world's biggest copper factory, used in power transmission lines.
Fine reddish-orange copper wiring from the world's biggest copper factory inside circuit boards.
Scrap reddish-orange copper returned to the world's biggest copper factory recycling unit.
Recycled reddish-orange copper melted again inside the world's biggest copper factory furnace.
Emission filters operating at the world's biggest copper factory, ensuring clean copper production.
Robotic arms handling reddish-orange copper products at the world's biggest copper factory.
Neatly stacked, 99.99% pure reddish-orange copper cathodes at the world's biggest copper factory.
Thousands of reddish-orange copper rods stored in the world's biggest copper factory warehouse.
Reddish-orange copper sheets passing through rolling mills at the world's biggest copper factory.
Morning sunlight shines over the world's biggest copper factory, highlighting ongoing reddish-orange copper production.